For 12 years, Thomas believed the official story. His older sister Martha was the victim of a tragic animal attack on the Appalachian Trail. He channeled his grief into becoming a park ranger in the same forest, a quiet tribute to the life she lost. But when a controlled burn clears a long overgrown section of woods, a ranger crew unearths the tattered remains of Martha's camouflage tarp. And inside its hem, a secret message stitched with dental floss transforms a tragic accident into a terrifying manhunt. It's incredible how a single discovery can unravel years of accepted truth. Before we delve into what Thomas found, if you appreciate stories where quiet determination brings long-hidden secrets to light, consider showing your support for our channel. It helps us continue to bring these compelling narratives to you. The air in the Great Smoky Mountains had a familiar chill in the autumn of 2006. For Thomas, now 32, the scent of damp earth and pine was more home than the apartment he slept in. He adjusted the pack on his shoulders, his boots crunching rhythmically on the trail. Being a park ranger here wasn't just a job. It was a promise. A promise he'd made to the ghost of his sister 12 years ago. He was only 20 when Martha, at 24, had disappeared. She was an experienced solo hiker, vibrant and fearless, and the thought of her being taken by a black bear had never sat right with him. But it was the story the evidence told. A torn tent, a ravaged campsite, and a few inconclusive tracks. It was the story he had forced himself to live with. His walkie-talkie crackled to life, breaking the morning silence. It was the crew chief from the prescribed burn team working over on the North Carolina side of the park. "Thomas, you on Channel 3? "Go for 3, Thomas answered, stopping to lean against an old oak. "We've got something for you over at the Hazel Creek burn site. Sector 4. Looks like some old camping gear." "Real old." "Figured with your history." "Well, you might want to see it." Thomas's stomach tightened. With your history. Everyone knew why he'd joined the service. He was the quiet ranger whose sister had been lost to these mountains. "On my way," he said, his voice steady despite the sudden spike of his pulse. He knew the area. Hazel Creek was less than 5 miles from where Martha's last campsite had been found. It was a section of forest so dense with undergrowth that it had been largely impassable for years. The controlled burn was the only reason anyone would be able to see the ground there now. When he arrived, the scene was a strange mix of black, scorched earth, and the green of surviving trees. The burn crew stood around a small clearing, their faces somber. In the center of the clearing, snagged on the roots of a half-burnt rhododendron bush, was a tattered piece of fabric. It was a camouflage tarp. Sun-bleached and torn, but he recognized it instantly. It was the custom leaf-pattern tarp Martha had been so proud of, the one she'd saved up for months to buy. A younger ranger handed him a pair of nitrile gloves. "We didn't touch it much, just cleared the brush around it," he said gently. Thomas knelt, his heart pounding against his ribs. The tarp was in terrible shape, ripped in several places, but it was hers. For 12 years, this piece of her life had been lying here, hidden, waiting. As he carefully examined the weathered material, his fingers brushed against the hem. Something felt wrong. It was too thick, too stiff. It wasn't the clean, factory-stitched edge he remembered. Running his thumb over it, he felt a series of small, hard bumps, almost like tiny knots hidden within the fabric. This wasn't damage from the elements. This was deliberate. He arranged for the tarp to be carefully packaged and taken back to the main ranger station as evidence. That night, in the quiet solitude of his small cabin, he laid the tarp out on his table under a bright lamp. With a small knife, he painstakingly picked at the stitches along the thick hem. They weren't thread. It was dental floss, mint-flavored, the kind Martha always carried. Inside the fold of the hem, he found it. Not a letter, not a note, but a series of tiny, almost invisible knots tied in a long strand of that same floss. It was a code, a simple substitution cipher they had invented as kids to pass notes in class. Each knot, or a series of knots, represented a letter. His hands trembled as he began the slow process of decoding. It was a language he hadn't used in nearly 20 years, but his mind and fingers remembered the patterns. It took him over an hour, his breath held tight in his chest. When he was done, he stared at the words he had transcribed onto a notepad, the pencil nearly falling from his numb fingers. The message was short, and it was chilling. Beard man watching. Not alone. Smiles too much. K, the official story of a tragic animal attack crumbled into dust. A bear hadn't killed his sister. A man had. And Martha in her final days had tried to leave a warning. The K had to be an initial. His mission, the one he had unknowingly been preparing for over the last decade, was suddenly crystal clear. He had to find out who K was. The next morning, Thomas drove to the park's administrative headquarters, a place that housed decades of paper records in a climate-controlled archive. He needed the trail logs from the spring of 1994. The clerk, a woman who had worked there for 30 years, looked at him with pitying eyes as she retrieved the dusty, leather-bound logbooks. She knew his story, too. He spent the entire day hunched over the fragile pages, the smell of old paper filling his lungs. He found Martha's neat signature, her entry and expected exit dates clearly marked. Then, he began the painstaking work of cross-referencing every hiker who had signed in on the same trail system during that 2-week period. He made a list of every name that started with the letter K. There were 7 of them: Kevin, Kyle, Keith. It was a start, but it was a cold trail. These people could be anywhere in the country by now. He felt a familiar wave of hopelessness, but he pushed it down. This was more than he'd had for 12 years. As he was about to pack up, an idea struck him. He needed to talk to someone who was there, someone whose memory might hold a detail that a paper log never could. There was only one person who fit that description: George, the retired head ranger who had led the initial search for Martha. George was in his late 70s now, living in a small house on the edge of town. Thomas found him on his porch, carving a piece of wood. George's eyes, still sharp, lit up with recognition. "Thomas, good to see you, son. What brings you out here?" Thomas sat down and explained everything: the tarp, the hidden hem, the dental floss, and the cryptic message. He showed George the list of 7 names. George stared at the paper for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tapped his finger on the 4th name on the list. "Kenneth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I remember that one. Kenneth Paulson." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you remember about him?" "Not much, and that's what was strange," George said, looking out toward the mountains. He didn't seem like a serious hiker, too clean. Hung around the ranger station for a couple of days before he went up the trail. Kept asking questions, odd questions. "What kind of questions?" Thomas pressed. George met his gaze. He asked about the trails, sure, but he also asked about who was on them. Specifically, he asked if many women hiked alone. I told him it was perfectly safe, that the wildlife was more of a concern than the people. I remember he had this unsettling smile, just a little too wide, you know? "Never thought much of it after your sister's case was closed. It was a bear," they said. "But a man with a beard who smiles too much, damn it, that was him." The detail was never logged. It wasn't a crime to be creepy. But for Thomas, it was everything. He had his suspect. He thanked George, his mind racing. Back in his cabin, he used his personal laptop and the station's internet to run a search for Kenneth Paulson. It took him a few hours of digging through public records, but he found him. Kenneth had moved from North Carolina a few years after Martha's death. He now lived a quiet life in a small town in Virginia, 2 states away. The final piece of information Thomas found made the hair on his arm stand up. For the past 8 years, Kenneth Paulson had been working as a high school librarian. The image of the creepy man with the beard and the unsettling smile contrasted so sharply with the idea of a quiet, bookish librarian that it felt like a punch to the gut. This was the twist. The monster Martha had warned him about wasn't some wild mountain man living off the grid. He was hiding in plain sight, surrounded by children. Thomas knew he couldn't just call the Virginia police and tell them a 12-year-old cipher on a piece of dental floss pointed to their local librarian. They'd think he was crazy. He needed more. He needed to see the man for himself, to look him in the eye. He put in a request for a week of personal leave, citing a family matter. In a way, it was the truest thing he had ever written. He packed a small bag, placed the transcribed note from Martha's tarp in his wallet, and started driving north. The confrontation was coming, and he had to be the one to force it. The drive to Virginia felt both too long and too short. With every mile that passed, Thomas rehearsed what he would say, what he would do. He was a park ranger, trained to handle wildlife and lost hikers, not to confront a potential murderer in a quiet suburban town. When he finally arrived, he checked into a cheap motel and spent the afternoon doing reconnaissance. He found the high school where Kenneth worked, a sprawling brick building with a perfectly manicured lawn. He drove past Kenneth's house, a modest, tidy home with a garden in the front yard. It was all so painfully normal. The next morning, he went to the local police department. He spoke to a detective named Miller, a wary-looking man in his 50s. Thomas laid out the story, showing him a photo of the tarp and the decoded message. Miller listened patiently, but Thomas could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Son, this is compelling for you. I get that," Miller said, handing the photo back. "But legally, it's nothing. A 12-year-old piece of fabric with a kid's coat on it? A retired ranger's vague memory of a creepy guy? A judge would laugh it out of court. We can't get a warrant based on this." "I'm not asking for a warrant," Thomas said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I'm going to talk to him. I just want you to know I'm here. If something happens, if he runs," Miller sighed. "Look, I can't officially sanction this, you understand? But you give me a call if you think you've got something solid. We can have a car in the area." It was the best he was going to get. Thomas's plan was simple. He would go to the high school library during its public hours in the late afternoon. He walked in, the scent of old books and floor polish hitting him. And there he was. Behind the main desk, stamping books, was Kenneth Paulson. He was older now, in his late 40s with thinning hair and glasses. The beard was long gone. He looked harmless. If it weren't for George's memory, Thomas would have thought he had the wrong man. He browsed the shelves for a few minutes, his heart hammering. Then he approached the counter with a book about Appalachian history. Kenneth looked up and gave him a practiced, professional smile. It was the smile. A little too wide, not quite reaching his eyes. It was him. "Just this one today?" Kenneth asked pleasantly. "Yes, thank you," Thomas said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "I'm actually planning a trip down to the Smokies, doing some research." Kenneth's interest seemed to perk up. "Oh, really? It's a beautiful part of the country. I spent some time there myself, years ago." "I'm particularly interested in the Hazel Creek area," Thomas said, watching the man's face carefully. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign of alarm. "Just polite interest." "A rugged section for experienced hikers," Kenneth noted, sliding the book into a plastic sleeve. Thomas decided to take the plunge. "My sister was an experienced hiker," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "She died there, actually, back in 1990. Maybe you heard about it. A woman named Martha Freeman." For the first time, Kenneth's smile faltered, a barely noticeable twitch at the corner of his mouth. I'm sorry to hear that," he stammered, his eyes darting away from Thomas's. "That was a long time ago. I don't recall the name." He was lying. Thomas could feel it. "It was a tragedy. The Park Service said it was a bear attack." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Kenneth could hear. "But my sister was a careful camper. Always noted everything in her journal. Funny, the last thing she wrote, it wasn't about bears. It was about a man she'd met on the trail." Kenneth's face had gone pale. He busied himself with the computer, refusing to look up. "I'm sure the authorities did a thorough investigation," he mumbled. This was it. The final push. Thomas took a steadying breath. She didn't write his name, just a description. And one strange detail. She said, "He smiled too much." That was the detail that broke him. It was a detail that was never in any police report, never released to the media. It was a detail only two people in the world could have known, Martha and the man she was describing. Kenneth's composure shattered. His hands started shaking, and he dropped the book on the counter with a loud thud. He looked up at Thomas, his eyes wide with panic and cornered fury. "I don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, his voice trembling. "I think you should leave." "She knew you were watching her, Kenneth," Thomas said, his own voice now a cold, hard whisper. "She left me a message." That was all it took. Kenneth shoved the counter, sending books scattering, and bolted from behind the desk, heading for a side exit. Thomas didn't chase him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and sent a one-word text to Detective Miller. "Now." Kenneth didn't get far. As he burst through the library's side door, two uniformed officers were waiting for him. He gave up without a fight, slumping to the ground in defeat. At the police station, under the weight of the direct accusation and the impossible detail about his smile, Kenneth Paulson confessed to everything. He told them how he had become obsessed with Martha on the trail, how he had stalked her for days, enjoying her fear. He'd finally confronted her at her campsite, and when she had fiercely rejected his advances, he flew into a violent rage. He murdered her and then, in a moment of cold calculation, tore up her campsite to make it look like the work of a bear. He had thought he'd committed the perfect crime. He never imagined that a bit of dental floss and a childhood code would unravel it all 12 years later. A month later, Thomas was back on the trail at Hazel Creek. He found the blackened patch of earth where the burn crew had discovered the tarp. There, at the base of the old rhododendron, he built a small cairn, a simple tower of stones to mark the place where his sister's voice had finally been heard. The grief was still there, a familiar weight in his chest, but it was different now. It was no longer a raw wound of confusion and doubt. The truth had provided a strange, quiet peace. He had fulfilled his promise. He looked up through the canopy of trees to the blue sky above, the same sky Martha had looked at on her final day. For the first time in a long time, he could walk these trails not just in mourning, but in honor of the smart, brave woman she was, and the love between a brother and sister that had proven stronger than time and stronger than evil. Do you think a person can ever truly find peace after a tragedy like this, even when justice is served? The past has a way of leaving scars, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what it takes to heal. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a tale of resolve and justice. Your support helps these important stories reach more people. Thank you for listening.